Call the meeting to order. Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics. Today, meeting number 85. And we're here to discuss a letter from Mr. Peter Kent. Peter.
Thank you, Chair, and Happy New Year to colleagues around the table. And I thank you for your decision to call this to this meeting in response to my letter, Mr. Chair. Just to remind the committee and for the record, my request to you was to place a motion today to be considered by committee that the committee invite the Prime Minister to discuss Commissioner Dawson's finding in the Trudeau report released by the Commissioner's office on December 20th, 2017, and that this meeting take place either on January 17th or January 18th, 2018. And to explain the logic behind this request, Chair, I'll remind all members that the Commissioner released her report, the Trudeau report, 1 week after the House of Commons rose in December. Several hours after that report was released, the Prime Minister did meet with the media in the lobby of the House and held what I think is most fairly described as a disjointed news conference, struggling to answer some very basic questions from journalists with regards to the Commissioner's findings. The Prime Minister did make an apology in that news conference, but it was a qualified apology, and in the same sentence, he made clear that he disagreed with Commissioner Dawson's finding against his claim of a deep and lasting relationship with the Aga Khan. Why today's meeting? Why my motion before the committee today? Well, most members of Parliament should be back on the clock. We've all had an appropriate holiday break. And just as important, the Prime Minister's schedule this month is somewhat more flexible than it will be, I anticipate, come the end of the month when the House resumes and when he will have obligations elsewhere in the country and abroad. Why this motion to invite the Prime Minister? Well, questions with regards to his holiday in the Caribbean in question period throughout the year, this past year, have not been met with meaningful answers. This committee is empowered by standing orders of the House of Commons to respond to the reports and consequences reported by the Ethics Commissioner. This is a calm and it's a respectful setting to discuss the Commissioner's findings with the subject of that investigation and that report, the Prime Minister of Canada. There is no heckling. Questions are respectfully answered, and questions can be put in a relaxed manner over a period of an hour or two. This committee has had a succession of ministers, department officials, deputy ministers, and commissioners in recent months without mishap, without complaint. What would such a meeting discuss with the Prime Minister? Well, aside from questions about his initial qualified apology, there are elements of the Prime Minister's testimony contained in the Commissioner's report and observations and conclusions by the Commissioner in this extensive report, 60 or 70 pages, depending on how you measure them, and comments by the Prime Minister, for example, on the way he sees himself as Prime Minister in situations with stakeholders or those petitioning for favors or financial benefit from the Government of Canada. And I would point to the Commissioner's observation that she concluded that the Prime Minister felt that he could appear on 2 occasions with the Aga Khan, for example, exposing himself improperly under the Conflict of Interest Act on the excuse that he wasn't there on official business, he was there to build relationships. Now yesterday, and to come to the motion before us, yesterday the spokesman at the Prime Minister's office said that Liberal members of this committee were not influenced in the decisions that they will take here today, and that they were open to vote their conscience, to make their own choices on whether or not to support this motion. I must say I was disappointed this morning in the Prime Minister's remarks on the East Coast when he said that he wants to avoid the Ottawa news bubble, that he wants to take questions on this matter from Canadians in roundtables and town halls across the country. And I would simply respectfully remind the Prime Minister that he has the same duties and obligations as every member of Parliament to be accountable to Parliament, to respect the rules and regulations and the laws of Parliament, particularly the Conflict of Interest Act. And given the unprecedented serious findings of four violations of significant elements of the Conflict of Interest Act, I believe it is his responsibility to make himself available to members of Parliament to discuss the report and his feelings about the Commissioner's findings. And there is no more appropriate location, I believe, than before this committee, which is responsible for the ethical practices of the House of Commons. So that said, I would I'll close here, Chair, and I'll simply invite my Liberal colleagues to walk through the door that was so generously opened by the Prime Minister's office yesterday and support my motion to invite the Prime Minister to attend this committee in the near future.
Thank you, Mr. Kent. I have a speaking order here. I have Mr. Cullen next.
Thank you, Chair. And I share the salutations. Happy New Year to everyone around the table. It is somewhat unusual to have a meeting around this particular point in time, but yet I think we're into we're into uncharted waters a bit. We've never had a report from an ethics commissioner quite like this, and so I think our response should also meet the seriousness of what's happened. My colleague mentioned the notion of an opportunity. I would put to my Liberal colleagues in particular, because I suspect the instinct might be to oppose a motion like this. Political calculation about a sitting Prime Minister appearing before a committee, answering questions. While it's not unprecedented in Canadian history, it is unprecedented to have a Prime Minister who's been found in violation of the Ethics Act. We have not had that before. So I, too, as I'm sure some of my friends across the way, watched the press conference that followed the release of this report. It was clear that some of the questions not only caused the Prime Minister some challenge in answering directly, but that the average Canadian watching this and looking for answers to some pretty specific points and decisions that the Prime Minister and his office made with regards to this trip would have left that press conference still not having those answers. I don't want to knock down question period too much, Chair, because it does serve a purpose and allows certain things to be demonstrated from time to time that we all know as members of Parliament when something that is of a serious nature that requires time and examination, that committees is where the best work of Parliament happens. I think, and I hope my colleagues share this view, that this committee works very well, even when discussing issues that have been difficult around access to information and privacy and ethics, that I've in only rare instances felt any of the bad elements of partisanship enter into our conversations. I think this committee works very well in producing the reports that we've done, and often those are unanimous. Now, I wanted to be completely open, and I'm addressing mostly my Liberal colleagues here. I've heard Mr. Kent's sentiments. I share some of those, if not all of them, about the intention behind such a meeting for me. I take this incredibly seriously, that influencing of office holders, as we all are, is something that's very important to me. I think it's important to the people I represent. I hope it's important to all of us and the people we represent, that we, regardless of our partisan interests, regardless of our specific issues that we fight on, that the issue of not being influenced, of having clear ethical rules and clear consequences to breaking those rules is important for the trust that Canadians need to maintain in all of us, regardless of what views those Canadians hold. We hope they all hold the idea that ethics matter, that this isn't a game. I think there was an unfortunate analogy used by the Prime Minister this morning referring to this as partisan games. I don't take ethics as a game. I think this is actually incredibly important. I'm sure the Prime Minister, I'm not sure, I assume the Prime Minister didn't intend the comments to be taken that way, but referring to things that happen here in Parliament as partisanship and games and everything else that happens is serious is a wrong interpretation of our world, because then it implicates Parliament as being nothing but that. The Prime Minister Trudeau set a very high bar coming into office, particularly coming out of, no offense, Mr. Kent and others, the previous government, in which accountability and transparency was a problem, where we saw the affairs of the Senate and other issues, Elections Act and whatnot, that the Prime Minister came forward as a candidate and then as a sitting Prime Minister with some very strong and clear directives. And I remember being quite taken by some of those commitments around things like conflicts of interest. Not just the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law, not to not only be not found in a conflict of interest, but even the appearance of a conflict of interest. I remember thinking that's a very high and appropriate bar for us to have as public office holders. So one of the questions, again, being transparent to my Liberal colleagues so they not concern themselves with this being some sort of a malicious attempt, would be in the Prime Minister's mandate letters that he set out for all members of Cabinet, which I assume applied to him as well, that in entering this Liberal Cabinet, that one of the clear rules would be not to be in a conflict of interest, not to be in the appearance of a conflict of interest. And that's a clear quote that we're all familiar with. I assume in putting that rule down, whenever an organization or a leader sets a rule, if the rule is broken, there's consequences. That if a cabinet minister were to fall into a conflict of interest or appearance of conflict of interest, there would be a consequence to that action. Otherwise, what's the point of having the rule? The challenge we have in this case is that the boss himself has broken the rule, as has been found by the Commissioner of Ethics, conflict of interest in ethics. I'm trying to imagine the average workplace for a Canadian. You go to work for somebody, they say, if you're going to work here, here are the rules that you have to follow. You can't accept gifts if you're working at a bank from somebody who's doing business with the bank. But then the next day you come into work and you see the bank manager accepting a gift from somebody doing work with the bank. You can draw a couple of conclusions. You can say, well, that rule doesn't really mean anything, and I too can do it, or you want to raise concerns with it. My assumption of the Prime Minister is in setting these rules, his intention was good, to restore public faith that had been lost in elected office, and to combat the cynicism that he often, and we often deal with from those who are not in politics, saying, well, it's all just a game, it's all just people looking out for themselves, and so he set these rules. If there's no consequence other than a report and an awkward, if I can use that term, press conference, then that doesn't seem to be much of a deterrent for those who are intentionally looking to break the rules. Another question I would have, as it was reported out through Ms. Dawson, the now former commissioner, was the choice and decision not to recuse himself from meetings that pertained to the foundation that was established by the Aga Khan to lobby the government. I misspoke that. The foundation exists. There's a lobbying group that has been established to lobby on behalf of the Aga Khan's foundation. Having just in a few days prior returned from a trip that was essentially paid for except for the commercial flights by the Aga Khan, to then be in a meeting in which dealing with business that affected the Aga Khan's foundation's interest, to not recuse yourself from that meeting is a question that I have for the Prime Minister. It's a question that remains unanswered to this date. This is the forum to do it. This is the forum where we can have a civil exchange, as Mr. Kent has talked about, and find out where the lines are in the Prime Minister's own mind. Because clearly, how he interprets these rules and their application, the application of these rules, affects not just him, but everybody in his cabinet, and I would think by extension all of Parliament. I don't know how if in another scenario, I'm trying to imagine a scenario in which, I was going to say normal members of parliament, but not prime ministers, would find themselves in. And somebody offered one of us a nice painting. And it was nice, and we said thank you, and we accepted it. And it was later found out and determined by the Commissioner of Ethics that that was accepted inappropriately. We should never have accepted the painting. Natural justice for me, and I don't know about my colleagues, at a bare minimum would be to return the painting. I would think. You wouldn't keep it, would we? For Canadians watching, I think a relevant question I would put to the Prime Minister is, if we have now, and I don't think he's denied this, I could be wrong, someone will correct me, he has now admitted that the accepting of this trip was inappropriate. That to ask for and receive a vacation to a private island for himself, his family, and some friends, while the Aga Khan was also lobbying his office, the Prime Minister's office, was inappropriate and broke the ethical rules that we have. Why there hasn't been a suggestion from the Prime Minister to not pay that back, and I'm going to disagree with my Conservative colleagues about the payment back of security fees. I have a different view of things. I think the Prime Minister incurs costs of security just by the nature of being a Prime Minister, but the cost of the trip itself remains for me. What's the difference? What's the difference between accepting that painting on the wall or a free trip if both of those gifts were found to be against our ethical rules? Why does the Prime Minister remain in the enjoyment of that free vacation when that would not be something that would be offered to somebody else, as the Commissioner found in her report? That the argument, Chair, of friendship, hey, do you want to use my cottage for the weekend, old buddy, doesn't work and did not qualify and did not satisfy our Commissioner. So I don't want to go on more than this, because I'm curious about my Liberal colleagues, what their views are. I believe questions remain unanswered. The Prime Minister is by law and nature accountable to Parliament. Town halls are great. Do them all the time. But it does not substitute for this, and should not be seen as a substitution for that. And I think Canadians would broadly agree. They enjoy the opportunity to ask their Prime Minister questions. The Prime Minister of Canada is accountable to Parliament, ultimately. We all, none of us sitting around this table, are in the government. None of us are in Cabinet. We don't work for the Prime Minister's office, none of us. Our job, collectively, is to hold the government to account, because the government has an extraordinary amount of power. That's the nature. The founders of our country built this for us to do our jobs. It is unprecedented, not unprecedented, it is maybe unusual for a Prime Minister to appear before a parliamentary committee. My commitment is, and I hope my colleagues know this of me enough, in our experiences, would be to treat him with the utmost respect deserving of his office, and to ask questions that I believe pertinent and on the minds of Canadians about the rules as he interprets them, about the consequences for breaking those rules as he interprets them, and the culture that has been created in his office and in his cabinet with respect to ethics and conflicts of interest. I would also endeavour colleagues today from the Liberals, because we've heard, Chair, previously in conversations that Liberals are open to the idea of the Act, reviewing the Act, strengthening the Act, as Madam Dawson has urged us many parliaments now. I think it would be encouraging to hear from the Prime Minister an actual commitment to make some of the changes, and I would be curious about his ideas. What changes could we make that would more firmly and clearly define what the rules are, remove some of the loopholes that have been identified by the Commissioner of conflict of interest, and move this forward so that it's not simply a concerning scandal or an issue that was raised with the Prime Minister's choices around a trip, but something that is actually demonstrably an improvement of Parliament and the trust Canadians can have in it. So I look forward to my comments from my Liberal colleagues across the way, and for us resolving this. And while I do appreciate the instinct might be to resist such a scenario as calling the Prime Minister, I would say it actually would do, and I think he's capable, more than capable, of performing such a role, of answering hopefully thoughtful questions from us as committee members and understanding how we can make things better and understand the decisions that were made.
Thank you, Mr. Cullen. Next up, I have Mr. Gord. Go ahead, Mr. Gord.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Tout d'abord, moi aussi, à mon Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To begin, I would like to start by wishing everyone a happy new year. First, we're here to discuss inviting the Prime Minister before the committee. We believe it is a relevant move, and we must engage in this exercise. Anyone who believes that the committee is exaggerating, I would not agree with, because that is the point of the committee. There is a Conflict of Interest Act. We have legislation. This is to help guide members of Parliament, and it is a way to frame our work. If someone has deviated from these rules, explanations should be forthcoming to the commissioner or to the committee, and it's up to the committee to make recommendation. This is what our work is comprised of. Now, the Prime Minister has been to the Aga Khans Islands several times, 3 times, in fact, and 2 of these trips have led to complications because these trips were organized by the PMO. It was not a last-minute spontaneous decision. For those of you who read the report, well, you learned that the trip began to be organized in 2016. The trip happened in December of that year, and people involved in the organization knew there were challenges as to how to get to the island itself, and there were certain ways of getting there, but perhaps a different means of transportation should have been used. So in this entire process, I have questions. Perhaps the Prime Minister could have avoided this conflict of interest. And unfortunately, in the Conflict of Interest Act, there's not 1, 2, or 3, but there are 4, in fact, provisions which were violated. And this is a unique situation in the history of our country that the Prime Minister violated a federal act. We would expect our Prime Minister to be above any suspicion. And of course, the Canadian Prime Minister must respect Canadian law, and the Canadian Prime Minister should lead by example. We also have concerns with regard to the last trip, which included members of the Prime Minister's family and other guests. We do not necessarily know who all these guests were. These guests, did they have any specific questions to ask? Did they receive any special considerations? The Aga Khan has foundations, and the Government of Canada is involved with these foundations. And we're talking about a good deal of money, over $15 million. So why was the Prime Minister given so much attention on the Aga Khans Island? Over the year, we heard that the Prime Minister and the Aga Khan are personal friends, but I wouldn't call friends whom I haven't spoken with for 30 years personal friends. So it seems that simply because if you've been elected to a higher political office, you become a person of interest to many other persons. And the Aga Khan is also in the lobbyist registry. Gifts were given, and these gifts far exceeded the value contained in the act. Is it possible that the Prime Minister may have been influenced with regard to any future decision? History hasn't told this, but perhaps this is a question we could put to the Prime Minister if he appeared before the committee. Now, in the defense of the Prime Minister, when you read the report, there are some strange things in there. It has even been said that the English and the French versions contradicted each other in some places, and people seem to be using the version which suits their purposes best. So perhaps if we are going to review the Act, we should take a closer look of the translation to make sure that both versions are the same. Another strange thing in this whole affair is that the Prime Minister and the government in 2015 presented amendments to the Act to strengthen the provisions governing travel, and yet these very provisions are the ones that are at issue here. So it seems that what's good for the goose is not necessarily good for the gander, the goose and the gander being the MPs on the one hand and the Prime Minister on the other. It is clear this act applies to everyone equally, to the Prime Minister and to all members of Parliament equally. The role of the Prime Minister under the law is a very important factor here. The Prime Minister must lead by example in all cases. Perhaps the Prime Minister did have good reasons, but I think it would be brave of him to come forward, and it should be his duty to come before the committee to explain himself. Not only to explain himself before this committee and its members, but at the same time before all Canadians. And it is the duty of the Prime Minister to be forthright in this situation. If he has honourable reasons, Canadians will accept those. And if Canadians do not, well, then politically we will see how that plays out. However, I was disappointed this morning when the Prime Minister said that this is simply partisan politics on the committee. I'm very disappointed, too, when I heard this, because we are all members of Parliament. We are all even. We don't all have the same roles and responsibilities, but at the end of the day, we're elected to represent our constituents, all Canadians, to the best of our abilities, in full respect of the rule of law. So I hope Mr. Trudeau will have the courage to appear before the committee, and I hope committee members will all agree with this. I am not going to dwell on this, but I believe that I had a duty to speak out, and I hope that altogether, if there are any weaknesses in provisions governing travel, that we altogether make recommendations. If we decide that the Act should stay as it is, well, perhaps we can strengthen the Conflict of Interest Act so that this kind of situation is not repeated in future. Canadians must understand that we are here to work for them and not we are not here to spend taxpayers' money to go on holidays. We have to pay our holidays with their own money. We know that taxpayers are willing to see their money spent on official business, but not on personal business. I will leave it at that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chair. Note, I don't begrudge you for holding a special meeting and bringing us all back from our ridings. I was childcare this week, so my wife begrudges you just a little bit. Over the last few years, I have at times, those across the aisle may recall on occasion, I have not been shy about calling out our government and calling for greater accountability at times. I read the Ethics Commissioner's report with interest twice, and I came to the conclusion that the report speaks for itself. The Commissioner found 4 contraventions of the Act, though it's important for Canadians to understand that she did not find that the Prime Minister acted improperly to further the AgriCon's interests. The Prime Minister, as everyone knows, immediately apologized, noted that something like this would never happen again and precautionary measures would be put in place, and use the words, "I take full responsibility," which I think is important. Now, as to the specific question of whether this committee ought to invite the Prime Minister to attend, I've heard some of the questions that the opposition might be interested in asking the Prime Minister. The opposition will, of course, have every opportunity to ask questions in question period when the House resumes. Of course, every Wednesday you will have a full question period to ask questions of the Prime Minister. Mr. Kent, you noted, of course, that the Prime Minister is crisscrossing the country, and Canadians will also have the opportunity to ask questions of our Prime Minister. We've discussed in the past on a number of occasions not turning this committee into another question period where things can get more partisan, this being one such issue I worry about as well. I know, Mr. Cullen, you mentioned getting to the substantive reform of the Act. I look forward to having the Ethics Commissioner before us tomorrow, asking her questions about her 2013 recommendations and possible reforms of the Act, but that's just it. I think this committee should be focused on that substantive work and not relitigating issues that we're likely to see in question period.
Thank you, Mr. Erskine-Smith. Up next, Madame Fortier.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to follow up on what my colleague, Mr. Nathan Erskine-Smith, said. I also read the report with interest, and we have to be clear. The Prime Minister cooperated fully with the Commissioner, with Commissioner Dawson, throughout the investigation. The Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner. This position was created by the House of Commons, and the mandate of the Commissioner is to do this type of investigation. She fulfilled her mandate, and as soon as the report was presented, the Prime Minister held a press conference immediately and answered the media's questions. He also accepted full responsibility and apologized to Canadians as well. The government, the Prime Minister committed to working with the Office of the Commissioner, and with regard to the recommendations, he would ensure that in future he would make sure that any holidays he takes with his family would follow the recommendations, and the Prime Minister will answer further questions in the course of the town halls he is holding across the country, and he'll be able to answer questions in the House of Commons at the end of January. Therefore, I do not believe it is necessary to hear from the Prime Minister at this committee. And I believe we should now we can meet the Commissioner tomorrow, and we will be ready to do so.
From Mr. Cullen.
Monsieur le Président, c'est un petit...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I find that these interventions a little troubling, and it's interesting for me to hear them because it's not quite true what my two colleagues across the table have said with regard to the Prime Minister's apologies. The apology was qualified.
Chair, when people in public life kind of apologize, it always drives me nuts. You know, just a straight apology, take full responsibility would have been welcome, because Canadians are very forgiving people in my experience. It was completely unqualified. And as was said earlier, the Prime Minister actually did disagree with the Commissioner about one of the main points of her report as to whether the Aga Khan was a friend or not. He, in that same press conference my friends referred, the use friend, personal family friend, was the most commonly used word other than and the, because the Prime Minister was disagreeing with the conclusions of the report actually without saying it, which is, you kind of can't half agree on something like this. There has to be the full agreement, and that was failed. One other small point, Chair, and this is something we would want to raise with the Prime Minister, is that the Commissioner was unable to find if the Prime Minister did forward the Aga Khan's personal interests or his foundation's personal interests, because she was not privy to the conversations that those happened. And there is, as my friends know, there are no minutes taken of those confidential meetings that were offered to the Commissioner. So she was unable to say whether he had or had not, and had to conclude on the side she had no evidence that he had. My direct question to the Prime Minister is, did you? Which has not been answered yet. In terms of suggesting that the press conference was the opportunity for the Prime Minister to be clear, he was asked a direct question from, I think it was Rosie Barton, I'm not positive because I couldn't see who was off camera, about what this decision says about is, I think she said moral compass or ethical compass, one of those two. This is the answer. I use that in quotations, and now here's the answer in quotations. The fact is, we work, sorry, just trying to reorder the thoughts, we work with the lobbying, no, the Conflict of Interest Commissioner on a regular basis on a broad range of issues when the issues come up. On the issue of my family vacation with a personal friend, it never occurred that there would be an issue here. Obviously, there was a mistake. The question was about ethical compass. The answer didn't answer the question, and also contradicted the ethics commissioner about the whole issue of the friend, which I find a bit bizarre, colleagues, just as on a personal note, that if she determined he was closer as a friend then this would be all okay, that you can accept pretty lavish gifts from somebody who is also lobbying your office individually. That's a loophole that people could exploit, and maybe was why the Prime Minister thought all of this was okay. To the point about whether we would have the opportunity in question period, and particularly Wednesdays, I've asked the Prime Minister questions about this issue in that forum. My 30-second question was not given really even the decency of a 30-second answer. Let's be perfectly clear. When we've asked very simple, straightforward questions of this issue, we get almost verbatim back a non-answer. The opportunity we have at a committee, as my colleagues know, is that you can have an exchange occasionally, and I think more than occasionally, a thoughtful exchange with a witness to talk about specific things. It's not just, it may be shocking to some, but this isn't just about Justin Trudeau. This is about the system that we have in place in Canada and whether it's sufficient to protect public interests when they cross over with private interests. There was a private interest to go on a trip. The Prime Minister's office was reluctant to reveal that trip. It was only because the media dug and dug and dug, and then they found out, and I can understand why there was reluctance. This isn't just about this one trip. It's about the culture that's created around a leader. We know how important that is. My colleagues across the way had concerns with the previous Prime Minister and the culture he created around him with regards to accountability, secrecy, and control. This would be an opportunity for this Prime Minister to demonstrate, not through words, but through actions, how he's different. It really would. I honestly believe it. And I also honestly believe he'll be capable of answering all of the questions that I've outlined for you today in an excellent way. I don't doubt it for a minute. He's a sitting Prime Minister for more than 2 years now, and he's been in politics long before that, or a while before that. These are real concerns. And if my friends don't think it merits an hour of our time at a committee, I'm not sure what would. Put yourself in our shoes. You have a sitting Prime Minister for the first time has been found in violation of the ethics rules that guide us as all parliamentarians. He's the most powerful elected figure in the country. Not only should the standard be the same as it is for all of us, I would argue it has to be even higher because of that power and that influence that he holds. It's worrisome to me that we're going to suggest that question period and an awkward press conference is enough when it comes to accountability for this government over what is obviously a pretty serious issue. I'm just imagining for my friends, my Liberal friends across the way, if this exact scenario had laid itself out for a Prime Minister Harper. I'm sure you'd be raising some of the same things that I have. So as it may seem like risk, I will offer this, that I think it's far riskier to deny this opportunity. I really do. Because the signal that is sent is, we can't be bothered to answer your questions. That we don't find this troubling enough to answer questions at a committee hearing. What has been, as Mr. Erskine-Smith has said, is generally, overwhelmingly well-chaired and a collegial affair. Of course, the energy would be up, or the intensity might be up when you have a Prime Minister in front of us, but he's also a colleague. He's also an elected member of Parliament, just like us. But he has higher responsibilities and has laid out for himself and all of his cabinet a higher standard. And that standard was broken. Does anyone deny that? And so my colleagues are going to suggest that the press conference and 30-second questions and question period is a sufficient response to having broken one of the central tenets of this government's promise to the Canadian people when you were elected. I profoundly disagree. I can understand the pressures my friends might be feeling from other colleagues, the Prime Minister's office, whoever, but I would suggest you resist those pressures and see the larger goal here, which is the confidence Canadians need to have in us when they elect us, whoever they elect, whatever the party stripe. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Cullen. Up next, Mr. Kent.
Yeah, I'd just like to come back briefly to some of the broader questions raised by the Commissioner's report, and specifically that area regarding the Prime Minister's testimony to Commissioner Dawson regarding the bilateral meeting on May 17th, 2016, where she writes that Mr. Trudeau testified that despite his relationship with the Aga Khan, he did not have any concerns about attending the May 17th, 2016 bilateral meeting with him. The meetings he attends, the Commissioner wrote, quoting the Prime Minister's testimony, and it was testimony in meeting with the Commissioner, as Prime Minister are not business meetings. Rather, he believes they are high-level meetings centered on relationship building, ensuring that all parties are moving forward together, specific issues or details are worked out before, subsequently, or independently of any meetings that he attends. Well, I think this raises questions far beyond the meetings with the Aga Khan. It raises questions about any meetings that he may have in future in the almost 2 years remaining in his term, with those seeking favors or funding from the federal government. Now, the fact he didn't find that he was attending a meeting improperly on official business because he was just there to relation build, the commissioner found was in violation of Section 21, one of the 4 violations that she found. And I think it's important for this committee, it's important for the House of Commons, it's important for the government, it's important for Canadians to know how this Prime Minister sees his role as Prime Minister in important meetings and with regards to the obligations that every member of Parliament and every public office holder has under the Conflict of Interest Act and the Code.
Any further discussion? I have no other names on the list. Then we'll call.
A recorded vote, Chair?
Certainly. So we'll call the vote.
On the motion, Mr. Erskine-Smith.
No.
Mr. Saini.
No.
Mr. Fergus.
Je vote non.
Madame Fortier.
No.
Mr. Biddle.
No.
Monsieur Picard.
No.
Mr. Kent.
Oui.
Monsieur Gourde.
Oui.
Mr. Cullen.
Yes. So the motion has been defeated, 6-3. And we'll re-adjourn tomorrow. Meeting's adjourned.